My name is Janet Ames, and I'm 24 years old. Last week, at my parents' Christmas table, my mother raised her wine glass and laughed and told me to be grateful. "You should thank us every day," she said, smiling so the relatives could see how warm she was. "We fed you, we clothed you. Your father quit his job to drive you to every audition. We begged casting directors for your roles. Everything you ever earned, this family earned together. That's why it was family money. That's how families work." My father nodded along, the way he always nods. I worked on camera from the time I was 6 years old. By the time I was 14, I'd carried a network sitcom and a closet full of commercials. They kept every check, every single one. And they called it family money. And they taught me to feel like a debt with legs. I didn't yell. I've learned that yelling is the one thing that lets my mother win. Because then the story becomes Janet's hysterical instead of Janet's right. I just took out my phone and I played a voicemail. One I'd found 3 weeks earlier on a dead phone in a box in my closet. A voicemail from my first agent, left when I was 12 years old. By the second sentence, my mother was halfway across the table, reaching for my phone. Because that voicemail proved that everything they just said, the sacrifice, the family money, the be grateful, was built on top of a crime. And my mother knew exactly which sentence gave it away. Before I go any further, if you were ever the child who earned the money the family spent, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps this story reach the people who need it. And drop your city and the time where you're listening from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel at night. I'm Janet. This is the story of a kid who worked since she was 6, the parents who kept all of it, and the law they never thought she'd learn. To understand the voicemail, you have to understand the money. And to understand the money, you have to go back to a soundstage in Los Angeles and a 6-year-old who thought work was a kind of game. I don't remember choosing any of it. That's the first thing people get wrong when they hear child actor. They picture a kid with a dream. I was 6. I had a dream about being a marine biologist and a dream about a dog. I did not have a dream about residuals. What happened was that my mother took me to an open call for a cereal commercial when I was 5 because a woman at her gym said I was camera pretty, and I booked it. Then I booked another. By 6, I had an agent, a man named Marty Holtz, who I'll get to. Because Marty matters more than anyone in this story except me. By 7, I had a recurring role on a network family sitcom that I'm not going to name. But if you watch television between 2009 and 2015, you have very likely seen my face, selling you something or saying something cute before a laugh track. I worked. I want to be precise about that word because my parents spent 18 years blurring it. It was work. 12-hour days on set, which for a minor means a studio teacher and legally mandated, breaks my parents constantly pushed against. Memorizing pages the night before, hitting marks, doing a crying scene 14 times because the light wasn't right, smiling on cue when I had a fever. I was good at it, not because I loved it, but because I was a careful, anxious child who had figured out that being good was the only way to make the adults around me calm. That instinct the one that made me a working actor at 6, is the same instinct that kept me quiet for the next 18 years. Hold that thought. It comes back. Let me give you a day so you understand it wasn't cute. A shoot day started before dawn. My mother would wake me at 5, run lines with me in the car, deliver me to set, and sign me in. There were rules. A child my age could only legally work a certain number of hours, had to have a set teacher, had to have breaks. I learned early that those rules annoyed my parents because every hour I wasn't allowed to work was an hour the production wasn't paying for me. I once heard my father argue with a studio teacher about my schooling hours like they were a line item eating into a budget. I was 8. The thing being budgeted was my education, and I was a professional in the way that breaks your heart a little to see in a small child. I didn't throw tantrums. I didn't forget my lines. Directors loved me because I was easy. No diva behavior, no meltdowns. Just a quiet little girl who hit her marks and went where she was pointed. I have since learned that easy child and child who has learned her feelings are inconvenient are very often the same kid. I was easy because I had figured out that being difficult cost something. And in my family, everything was measured by what it cost. And the money was real. Network television pays child actors well, and I worked steadily for the better part of a decade. We're not talking about a few $100s. We're talking, across those years, about a sum that would change most families' lives. It changed mine, just not the way the law intended. Because here's the thing I didn't understand until I was 24, the thing my parents were counting on me never understanding. In the state of California, the money a child earns on camera is not the parent's money. It is not family money. The law is extremely specific about this, and it exists precisely because of families like mine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At 6, I just knew that I went to the soundstage, and everyone clapped, and my mother was happy with me on the days I booked, and quiet with me on the days I didn't. I learned the exchange rate of that house early. My performance for her warmth. It was the first contract I ever signed, and no one read it to me. The story my parents told, to the relatives, to the neighbors, to me, was a story of sacrifice. My father, Ron, quit his job as a regional sales manager when I was about 8 to manage Janet's career full-time. That's how it was always phrased, like he'd taken on a noble burden. The truth, which took me years to see, is that my income had already outstripped his salary, so quitting cost the family nothing and gave him a title. He drove me to set. He sat in the parents' area. He called himself my manager, and at a certain point, started taking a manager's commission off the top of my earnings, on top of everything else. My father paid himself out of my money to drive me to the job I was doing. My mother, Sheila, was the architect. She didn't come to set as much, but she ran everything behind it, the schedule, the accountant, the bank, the story. She was the one who decided what we told people. And the story she built was airtight and self-flattering. We gave up everything for Janet. We poured ourselves into her. And so whatever comes back belongs to all of us. That's just family. I heard "that's just family" so many times it stopped being words. It was the wallpaper of my childhood. Anytime I noticed something that my younger brother Cody had newer everything, that we'd moved into a bigger house the same year my contract got renewed, that there never seemed to be money for my school trip, but always money for the family vacation. The answer was the same. We're a family. We share. Don't be selfish, Janet. Don't be one of those ungrateful kids you read about. There was a specific incident I think about a lot now. When I was 11, the 8th grade class trip was to Washington, D.C. $300, a permission slip, the whole thing. I brought it home. My mother looked at it and sighed and said money was tight that year, that the family was stretched, and that I should think about whether I really needed to go gallivanting when my father had given up his career for us. I didn't go. I told my friends I had a shoot. That same spring, we took a family trip to Hawaii. I remember standing in the airport and not even being able to form the contradiction in my head because the wallpaper was too thick. Tight for the school trip, flush for Hawaii. That's just family. I was 11, and I'd already learned not to do that particular math out loud. That last part was a recurring theme. My mother was obsessed with the cautionary tales, the child stars who turned on their parents, who got greedy, who forgot where they came from. She'd read those stories out loud at dinner, like warnings. I understand now that she wasn't warning me against becoming those kids. She was inoculating me against ever asking the question those kids had asked, which was a simple one. Where is my money? She did it constantly, and she did it with real artistry. She'd see a headline about some former teen actor suing their parents, and she'd shake her head sadly and say, "Can you imagine after everything those parents did? Dragging your own family through court for money you'd never have made without them. I'd be devastated if a child of mine turned out so cold." And she'd look at me, just for a second, just long enough. I'd feel the warmth withdraw a few degrees, the way it did on the days I didn't book, and I'd rush to reassure her. "I'd never do that, Mom." And she'd smile, and the warmth would come back, and the lesson would sink one layer deeper. By repetition, by temperature, by 1,000 small withdrawals and restorations. She trained me to experience the very idea of asking about my own earnings as a betrayal I'd be ashamed of. She didn't lock the vault. She made me the lock. By the time I was a teenager, I had fully absorbed the lesson. I believed in my bones that I owed my parents, that every dollar I'd earned was really theirs, payment for the gift of being born and fed and driven to auditions. I believed that asking about it would make me a villain. I had been raised, very deliberately, to guard the door of my own vault from the inside. And the most chilling part, looking back, is how completely it worked. How I would have told you, well into my 20s, that I'd had wonderful, sacrificing parents, and that I was the lucky one. That's not a kid who got robbed and knew it. That's a kid who got robbed and was taught to send thank you notes. My career ended the way most child careers end. I grew up, and the cute ran out. The sitcom wrapped when I was 14. The commercial bookings thinned as I went through the awkward years. By 16, I wasn't really working anymore, and by the way my parents talked about it, you'd think I'd failed them, that the family business had been me, and I'd let it go under by having the nerve to hit puberty. The money, I was told, was mostly gone. Raising a working child is expensive, Janet. The lessons, the wardrobe, the gas, The years of my father's lost income, the house we needed to be closer to the studios, it had all gone back into me, into us, into the family. There was, they said, a little left in some account the state had made them open, and I'd get that when I turned 18, but it wasn't much. When I turned 18, I got a check for a little under $4,000 and a lecture about how lucky I was that they'd managed things so carefully, because other families blew through it all. $4,000. For nearly a decade of work that at its peak paid more than both my parents had ever earned combined. I took the $4,000. I said thank you. I believed them. That's the part that's hardest to tell you. I believed them completely. I went off into my adult life carrying not resentment, but guilt. A low, constant guilt that I'd been an expensive child, a burden, a project that hadn't paid off. I became a script supervisor, which is the person on a film set who tracks every detail for continuity, because it turned out the anxious, careful, watch everything kid grew into an anxious, careful, watch everything adult. And there's a job for that. I was good at it. I built a modest life. I told myself I'd put the childhood behind me. I lived in a small apartment in North Hollywood with a roommate until I was 23. I drove a used car I'd paid for myself with my own adult money, the first money that ever felt clean precisely because no one called it family money. I was careful with it the way only someone who grew up watching money decide everything can be careful. And here's the cruel irony I can see now. I was scrimping in a shared apartment, budgeting every grocery run, feeling guilty for the rare takeout. A few miles from the house my own childhood earnings had bought, where my brother's private tuition was being paid, out of an account that was legally mine. I thought I was poor because I'd been an expensive kid who used up her welcome. I was actually poor because I'd been robbed. Those feel completely different from the inside, and my mother had made very sure I'd feel the first one. And every holiday I came home, and I sat at the table, and I let my mother tell the story of their sacrifice, and I nodded because I believed I owed her the nod. I'd watch her perform our family's history to the relatives, and I'd feel that old withdrawal and restoration of warmth, and I'd perform my part, grateful, easy, undemanding Janet, because 18 years of training doesn't switch off just because you've moved out. For 6 years after I turned 18, that's how it went. I was a grown woman who had earned a fortune as a child and felt somehow that I was the one who owed a debt. That is how good my mother was at her job. It took a dead phone in a cardboard box to crack it open. It was November. I was helping my parents clear out the garage. They were talking about downsizing, which should have been my first question. Downsizing from what, on whose money, but I wasn't there yet. And I found a box marked Janet Old. Inside was the debris of a child actor, headshots from when I was missing teeth, a SAG-AFTRA junior card, a call sheet from the sitcom, my name on the third line down, a few participation trophies from the youth soccer I'd played for exactly 1 season before it was cut for conflicting with a shoot schedule, and at the bottom, a phone, an old one, the kind I'd had at 11 or 12, dead for over a decade, the battery swollen against the back panel. I almost threw it out. I want you to sit with that. The thing that gave me my life back, I almost dropped in a contractor bag because the battery looked puffy. My mother actually said, glancing over, Just toss all that old junk, honey. No point hauling it around. She wanted it in the bag. I think about that a lot, how close it came, how she was standing right there telling me to throw away the one thing that would undo her. Neither of us knowing, but I'm a continuity person. I keep things. It's not sentiment exactly. It's a professional reflex that the detail you discard is always the one you need in the next scene. I brought it home, ordered a cheap charging cradle for that model online, and a week later, out of pure nostalgia on a slow Sunday, I powered it on to see what 12-year-old me had saved. The screen lit up with that old wallpaper. Photos of my friends from set, all of us in our little folding chairs. A note app full of lines I'd been memorizing. Scenes from a show that doesn't exist anymore. And a voicemail box with a handful of saved messages, the kind a kid saves and forgets. Most were nothing. A friend asking if I was coming to her birthday. A reminder about a wardrobe fitting. My own voice once practicing a monologue. And one was from Marty Holtz, my old agent. Left, the timestamp said, when I was 12 years old. I almost didn't listen to it because I barely remembered Marty by then. He'd retired when I was 15, and we'd lost touch, the way you lose touch with the adults from a childhood your parents controlled. The name was just a warm blur, an old man who'd been kind to me at auditions. But I pressed play because I'm a continuity person, and you always check the tape. And I want to tell you exactly what I heard because I have listened to it more times than I can count. And the second sentence is the one that changed everything. Marty's voice, older and gravelly, a little tired. "Janet, sweetheart, it's Marty. I know you're just a kid and you probably won't understand this message, but I want it on the record somewhere that isn't your parents' house. So I'm telling you. And someday maybe you'll hear it. Your mom and dad asked me again today to help them move money out of your Coogan account. I told them no. I told them it's illegal. That account is yours. It's protected by law until you're 18, and they cannot touch it. And I will not help anyone touch it. I've put it in writing to the studio, too. If anyone ever tells you that account was empty, you call me. You hear me? You call me." I sat on my floor and played it again. And again. I was 24 years old, and I had just learned from a 12-year-old saved voicemail the word that my parents had spent my entire life making sure I never learned. Coogan. I did what I do. I researched. The Coogan account that the California law is actually called the Coogan Law, named after a child star from the 1930s whose parents spent everything he earned, requires that 15% of a minor performer's gross earnings be set aside in a blocked trust account, a real one, at a real bank, in the child's name. The parents are trustees. They legally cannot withdraw it, spend it, borrow against it, or treat it as family income. It is the child's money, locked until the child turns 18. The law exists for one reason: because parents had been doing to their kids exactly what mine did to me for almost a century, and California finally made it a crime. 15% of what I'd earned, locked away, untouchable, just waiting for me at 18. I had gotten $4,000 at 18. Either 15% of nearly a decade of network television and national commercials added up to $4,000, which was laughable, impossible, off by an order of magnitude or more, or that account had been drained and someone had lied to me about it for 6 years. I spent that whole night on the floor with my laptop, going down the rabbit hole, and the more I read, the colder I got. I read about Jackie Coogan himself, the kid from the silent films, the original The Kid, who grew up to discover his mother and stepfather had spent nearly everything he'd earned, because at the time the law said a child's earnings belonged to the parents. I read about the law his case created in 1939 and how it was strengthened in 2000 to make the trust account mandatory and automatic. I read case after case of parents who drained these accounts and how the law treats them, not as a family disagreement, but as a breach of a legal trust. I read the exact phrase that undid me, that the trustee, the parent, holds the money in a fiduciary capacity, meaning the highest legal duty of loyalty, meaning the law does not care how much they sacrificed or how they feel about it. The money is the child's. Full stop. For 90 years, the law had been saying, in plain language, the exact opposite of everything my mother taught me at the dinner table. Marty's voicemail told me which of my two possibilities was true. They asked me again today to help them move money out of your Coogan account. Again. As in, not the first time. And he'd said no, and put it in writing to the studio, which meant somewhere there might be a paper trail older than my own memory. I need to be honest about what I felt sitting there, because it wasn't triumph. It was vertigo. Everything I thought I knew about myself, that I'd been a burden, an expensive failed project, a child who owed, flipped inside out in the space of one voicemail. I hadn't been a debt. I'd been a bank. And the people who'd raised me to feel guilty for the cost of my own existence had been quietly, expertly robbing the account the law built specifically to stop them. There's a particular grief in that flip that I don't have a clean word for. It isn't just anger about money. It's the realization that the guilt you carried your whole life, the thing that shaped how small you let yourself be, how little you let yourself ask for, how grateful you forced yourself to feel, was manufactured, installed, on purpose, by the people who were supposed to protect you, specifically so they could rob you, and have you thank them for it. I grieved the $4,000 for about a minute. I grieved the 18 years for a lot longer. I didn't call my parents. I didn't say a word at the next family dinner. The careful watch everything kid was fully awake now, and she knew that the worst thing you can do with evidence is show it to the person it indicts before you've made copies. The first thing I did was back up that voicemail 4 times, cloud 2 drives, and an email to myself. Then I started looking for Marty Holtz. Marty wasn't hard to find, which tells you something about how easy it would have been to find him any time in the last 6 years, if I'd ever been given a reason to look. He'd retired to a condo in Palm Springs. He was in his 70s now. When I called and said, "Marty, this is Janet Ames. I used to be one of your kid clients," there was a long pause, and then he said in that same gravelly voice, "Janet, the continuity in your eyes. I always said you'd end up running a set, not standing on one." He remembered me. He remembered all of them, it turned out. Agents who work with child actors remember the parents, most of all. I drove out to Palm Springs that weekend. I played him his own voicemail, the one I'd found. He listened with his eyes closed, and when it finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I wondered if that would ever surface. I left a few like that for a few kids. Most of them I was wrong to worry about. You, I was right. And then Marty Holtz told me what he'd seen 18 years ago. He told me my parents had come to him repeatedly, especially during the peak earning years, asking him to facilitate moving my earnings around the Coogan requirement, to route payments through my father's management company, to characterize income in ways that would keep it out of the blocked account, to release funds early. He'd refused. He'd told them it was illegal. And being a careful man who'd been burned before, he'd documented his refusals. Emails to the studio's business affairs office, notes to the family accountant, a paper trail establishing that he, the agent, had flagged the Coogan obligation and declined to help circumvent it. Your father had this whole pitch, Marty said, shaking his head. The management company. He'd set it up so that he was your manager, and managers take a commission, 15, 20%. That part was legal enough on its own. But then he wanted to run other money through it too. Wanted me to help him build the productions in ways that had let earnings land in the company account instead of your trust. I told him that's not management, that's laundering a kid's protected income, and I won't put my license near it. He looked out his window at the desert. Your mother was the one who pushed hardest. She had a way of making you feel like a monster for protecting a child from her. Like I was the one being unreasonable. She'd say, "It's our money, Marty, we're her parents. Why are you treating us like criminals?" He turned back to me. I treated them like criminals because that's what the law called them the second they asked. I'd seen it before. The Coogan name is on that law for a reason, kid. It's always the parents. He told me about Jackie Coogan, in case I didn't know. It's the boy actor whose own case built the law, whose mother spent his fortune, and told him it had been her right. 90 years, Marty said. And the same family keeps showing up in a different costume. I've represented 40-some kids. The good parents, you never think about the account because it just sits there doing its job. The bad ones, you can spot in the first meeting because the first thing they ask about isn't the role, it's the money and how fast they can get to it. He paused. Your parents asked about the money in the first meeting. I can't tell you the account was drained, Janet, he said finally. I left before you turned 18. But I can tell you they wanted to drain it, that they tried, and that I have it in writing. What happened after I was gone? That's a question for the bank and maybe for a lawyer. He gave me the box. 18 years of a careful man's caution handed across a kitchen table in the desert. As I was leaving, he caught my arm and his eyes were wet, and he said, I left those messages for a few kids over the years, the ones whose parents scared me. I never knew if any of them would land. You're the proof one did. Go get what's yours. I drove back from Palm Springs with that box on the passenger seat, and I kept glancing at it the whole 2 hours. The way you glance at something you can't quite believe is real. Inside, it was the one thing my parents' entire story couldn't survive. A witness who'd written everything down while it was happening, who had no reason to lie, who had tried to protect a 12-year-old and kept the proof for 18 years on the chance she'd grow up and come looking. The careful adult I'd become was about to be saved by a careful adult who'd watched out for the careful child I used to be. There's a kind of justice in that I still don't have words for. The lawyer's name was Diane Okafor, and she specialized in entertainment and labor law, which, in Los Angeles, is a real and busy specialty. I brought her the voicemail and Marty's box. She listened to the message once, then a second time with her eyes narrowed. The way I imagine I look at a continuity error. Then she started reading the documents, and the longer she read, the straighter she sat. "Okay," she said finally. "Let me explain what you have and what you don't. What I didn't have, yet, was proof of the final theft. The actual bank records showing the account emptied. But," Diane explained, "I had something close to as good. I was the beneficiary of that trust, and as an adult I had the absolute right to demand a full accounting of it. The bank, the trustees, like my parents, were legally obligated to account for every dollar that had gone into and out of that Coogan account. If it had been drained, the records would show it. There was nowhere to hide. And this," she said, holding up Marty's documentation, "is what makes it ugly for them. Because they can't claim ignorance. A lot of Coogan cases, the parents say, we didn't understand the law, we're not financial people. Your agent put them on notice in writing years ago that this was illegal and that he wouldn't help. That establishes they knew. That turns a mistake into a knowing breach of fiduciary duty." She set the papers down. "Janet, if that account was emptied and a $4,000 payout against the earnings you're describing tells me it almost certainly was. You have a claim to recover all of it, plus interest, plus, in cases this clear, potentially more." I asked her the question that actually mattered to me, the one that had nothing to do with money. Can they say it was theirs? That they earned it raising me? Diane looked at me with something like gentleness. "No, that's the whole point of the law. It was never theirs. Not the 15%. The state of California decided almost 100 years ago that this specific money belongs to the child, full stop, no matter how much the parents sacrificed or believed they were owed. There is no version of the facts where we fed you and drove you to set gives them a right to that account. The law already accounted for all of that. The 15% is what's left after the family's claim. It's the floor. And they went through the floor. I sat with that. It was never theirs. 18 years of guilt, of family money, of being raised to guard my own vault from the inside. And a lawyer was telling me, plainly, that the wallpaper of my entire childhood had been a lie with a name and a statute number. I asked Diane one more thing before I left. I asked whether it was normal, though whether she saw a lot of this. I think I wanted to know if I was special or a fool. She put down her pen and said something I've held on to. "Janet, I have a filing cabinet of these. The kids always come in thinking they're either crazy or greedy, because that's what the parents train them to think. The cruelty isn't just taking the money, it's that, they take the money and then install the guilt. So the kid guards the crime for them into adulthood. You're not crazy, and you're not greedy. You were robbed by people who taught you to apologize for noticing. That's the most common version of this story I see. You're not rare. You're just finally awake." We talked strategy. Diane wanted to send a formal demand for accounting, the clean, lawyerly path. And we would. but I told her there was something I needed to do first, in person at the family Christmas, and I needed to know it wouldn't hurt my case. She thought about it, because California is a one-party consent state, and the voicemail was left for me. I had every right to possess it and play it. Confronting them wouldn't waive anything. Just don't let them take or delete your only copy, she warned. I almost laughed. Don't worry, I said. I made copies. I'm a continuity person. I always make copies. I want to tell you why I chose to do it at the table, in front of everyone, instead of in a lawyer's conference room where it would have been cleaner. For 18 years, my mother had performed her sacrifice in public. The story of what we gave up for Janet was told at every holiday, to every relative, in front of me, designed so that I would sit there and absorb it and nod. The humiliation, the constant smiling, public restatement that I was a debt the family had generously carried had always been a public event. My aunt had heard it, my cousins had heard it. My little brother, Cody, had grown up hearing it, which is its own tragedy I'll get to. If the lie had always been told in front of the family, then the truth would be too. Not because I wanted a scene, because I wanted the same witnesses. I wanted every person who had ever watched my mother cast me as the ungrateful, expensive child to be in the room when it turned out the expensive child had been funding the family the entire time. The 2 weeks before Christmas were the strangest of my life. I sat on a secret that rearranged my whole history while my mother texted me about what to bring for the dinner. Can you do your green bean thing? Everyone loves it. I made the green bean thing. I bought presents. I held the voicemail in my pocket like a stone the whole time. I barely slept those 2 weeks. I'd lie awake rehearsing it. Not the legal part, the human part. I'd picture my mother's face. I'd picture the relatives, the ones who'd heard her sacrifice story for 20 years. I ran the scenarios the way Diane had taught me to think about the case. What's the worst outcome? What's the likely one? The worst outcome was that I'd play the voicemail and my mother would spin it the way she spun everything, and the relatives would close ranks around poor Sheila, who'd given up her life. And I'd be the cold, ungrateful child the cautionary tales had always warned about. Her whole 18-year inoculation campaign working exactly as designed, in real time, in front of me. I knew that was possible. She was very, very good. There were nights I almost called Diane and said, let's just do it on paper, no audience, no risk. There was one hard night. Cody called me. My brother, 19 now, in his second year at a private college. I'd never thought to wonder how my parents afforded. He was stressed about finals, and he talked for a while, and at the end he said, "Thanks for always being the chill one, Jan. Mom says you were so easy as a kid, never asked for anything. I'm sorry I'm such a mess compared to you." And I sat there with the phone and understood that the story had been used on him too, from the other direction, that my never asking for anything had been weaponized into a standard he felt he was failing, when the truth was, I never asked because I'd been trained not to, with money that was paying his tuition. I almost told him right there. I didn't. He deserved to find out the same time as everyone, so no one could say I'd plotted with one sibling against the parents. But that phone call is when I stopped being nervous and started being certain. because I realized this wasn't only about my $4,000 and my stolen account. It was about a machine my mother had built that ran on turning her children into roles. Me, the grateful earner, Cody, the cherished one who'd never measure up. And that machine would keep running on the next generation, on Cody's future kids, on whoever came after. Unless somebody stood up at the table and turned it off in front of everyone who'd been letting it run. If you've ever had to hold a truth that you knew would detonate your whole family and had to smile through the small talk while you waited for the right moment, tell me below how you held it. I don't think people understand how heavy a secret gets when you're the only one carrying it. Christmas at my parents' house in the valley. Maybe 14 people. My aunts, an uncle, a few cousins, my dad's old friend from the sales days, Cody home from school, my parents holding court. The tree, the wine, the green bean thing. My mother in her element, which is to say performing. It came the way it always came, around the time the wine got poured. Someone asked Cody about school, and my mother answered for him, glowing, about how proud she was of her kids. And then she turned the spotlight, the way she always did, onto the story of me. You know, none of this would exist without what we did for Janet, she said to the table, warm and expansive. Ron quit his whole career. I gave up everything. We drove this girl to every audition in the county. We begged for her roles. We built her up from nothing. And she was a wonderful little earner, she was. But my goodness, the cost of it. She laughed. People don't understand. Everything that child made went right back into raising her in this family. That's just what you do. That's family money. And I hope... She raised her glass toward me, smiling. The kill shot she'd fired 100 times. I hope you're grateful, Janet. I really do. Some kids never learn to be. The table did its soft, appreciative murmur. My aunt nodded. Cody looked at his plate, absorbing his own version of the lesson. And I felt the old reflex rise, the nod, the small smile, the absorbing. 18 years of it, right there in my neck, ready to go. I set down my fork. I said, "You know what, Mom? You're right, I should be grateful. Let me play something for the whole family. Something from back then for the holidays." She smiled, expecting a clip of little Janet being adorable. Oh, that would be sweet. I took out my phone, and I pressed play. The lie came first. Marty's voice didn't, not for a half second, because my mother was still smiling, still in her performance, before the words landed. "Janet, sweetheart, it's Marty. I know you're just a kid and you probably won't understand this message, but I want it on the record somewhere that isn't your parents' house." I watched my mother's face. The first sentence, she was still smiling. An old agent leaving a sweet message for a child star. How nice. "Your mom and dad asked me again today to help them move money out of your Coogan account." That was the second sentence. That was the one. My mother came up out of her chair. "That's enough. Janet, give me the phone." And she was reaching across the table, actually reaching, her hand out for the device, and the wine glass went over, red across the white cloth, and the table froze. I leaned back out of her reach and let it keep playing. I told them no. I told them it's illegal. That account is yours. It's protected by law until you're 18. and they cannot touch it, and I will not help anyone touch it. I've put it in writing to the studio, too. If anyone ever tells you that account was empty, you call me. You hear me? You call me." The message ended. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I've ever heard, and I have stood on sound stages when the AD calls for absolute quiet. My father said into the silence, "The lie," because he always reached for the lie. Marty was a troublemaker. He never liked us. He was angling for a bigger commission. So I gave them the evidence. I put my phone face down. Copies, always copies. And I took out the folder I'd brought, the one from Marty's box, and I laid the first page on the cranberry-stained tablecloth. This is an email from Marty to the studio's business affairs office, dated when I was 12. It flags that you two had asked to move my earnings out of the protected account and that he was declining to help because it's illegal. Next page. This is a note to the family accountant. Same thing. Next page. This is the Coogan Law, California Family Code. 15% of everything I earned as a child was required by law to be locked in a trust account in my name. You were trustees. You could not legally spend $1 of it. I kept laying pages down, one at a time, calm, the way I lay out continuity notes. The quieter I got, the more the room leaned in. My Aunt Pam had put down her wine. My uncle was reading the upside-down pages from across the table. "This one," I said, "is the studio's own record showing the account was set up. This one is the law that says 15% mandatory, automatic, untouchable until 18. I looked up. I did the arithmetic on what I earned, the parts that are public record, the series, the national spots. 15% of that isn't $4,000. It isn't $40,000. It's a number that would have changed my whole adult life. And it was sitting in an account with my name on it. And when I turned 18, you handed me $4,000 and a speech about how lucky I was." My mother had stopped reaching for the phone. She was standing very still now, which was worse. Then she denied it. The bigger denial, the one she'd been building my whole life. "We earned that money. Do you have any idea what we gave up? I gave up my entire life for you, and now you're going to sit here in front of everyone and accuse your own mother over some technicality." "It's not a technicality," I said. "I asked a lawyer. There is no version of this where it was your money. The law already subtracted everything you gave up. The 15% is what was left after all of that set aside for me. By law, because the state knew there were parents exactly like you." I kept my voice level. "The quieter you are, the louder it lands. I got $4,000 when I turned 18, Mom. You told me that was what was left. 15% of what I earned was not $4,000. It was a number with a lot more digits. So I'm going to ask you, in front of everyone, the question Marty told me to ask. Where is my money?" The final reveal wasn't a document. It was her face. Because my mother, who had an answer for everything, who had narrated our family for 2 decades, opened her mouth and nothing came out. And everyone at that table watched the woman who never ran out of words run out of words. And then she lost control. "It is this family's money," she screamed, and the relatives flinched back. "We are a family. We share everything. That money raised your brother. It bought this house. It kept all of us. You don't get to come in here and take it back now just because you found some voicemail after everything we did. You ungrateful." She stopped, but it was far too late. She'd said it in front of all of them. That money raised your brother. It bought this house. She'd just confirmed, screaming to a room full of witnesses, that she'd spent the money she'd spent 18 years swearing didn't exist. My father had his face in his hands. And down the table, my brother Cody had gone white. The consequences started before the wine had finished soaking into the tablecloth. It was Cody who spoke first, which I hadn't expected. My 19-year-old brother, in a voice that shook, said, "My tuition. You said you were paying my tuition from your retirement. You said..." He looked at me stricken. "Jan, did my school come out of your money? Your kid money?" I didn't have to answer. My mother's silence answered. And I watched my little brother understand, in real time, that the standard he'd been measured against his whole life, easy, undemanding Janet, who never asked for anything, had been funding his life with the money she'd been robbed of. He pushed back from the table and left the room. I found him later on the back step, and we sat out there in the cold for an hour, and that's a conversation that belongs to us, and not to this story, except to say he's okay now. We're okay. She didn't manage to ruin that, though she'd built the machine that could have. My Aunt Pam was the next to speak. She set down her napkin and said, very quietly, to my mother, "Sheila, you told us for years that Janet was difficult about money, that she resented the family. You told us she was one of those greedy child stars." Pam's voice was strange and flat. "You told us that so we'd never wonder, didn't you?" My mother didn't answer that one either. My father tried, weakly, one more time. "We can explain all of this privately. This isn't the place." But the place was exactly where I'd chosen it, and everyone knew it now, and no one moved to give them the private room where the story could be rebuilt. I gathered my folder. I left my wine where it had spilled. I said to the table more than to my parents, "I have a lawyer. Her name is Diane Okafor. On Monday, she's sending a formal demand for a full accounting of the trust account. That's the law. I'm the beneficiary, and they have to show every dollar. I didn't come here tonight to get my money back. The lawyer gets my money back. I came here so that all of you would know what the money was before they could tell you I made it up." I looked at my mother. "You always did this part in front of everyone." I figured the truth should get the same audience. If you've ever had to stop being the family's quiet one, if you've ever set a truth down in front of everyone and let it land where it fell, like this video and subscribe. There are so many of us who learned too late that being easy was never the same as being loved. The legal part was slower and less dramatic than the table, the way it always is. Diane sent the demand for accounting. My parents, through a lawyer of their own, spent about 2 months trying to claim the records were lost, incomplete, that the account had been spent on legitimate expenses for Janet's benefit. But Marty's documentation was the thing that sank them, exactly as Diane had predicted. You can argue ignorance. You cannot argue ignorance when your child's own agent put you on written notice years in advance that what you were doing was illegal. The we didn't understand defense was dead before it opened its mouth. The accounting, when it finally came, showed what I already knew. The account had been systematically drained over years. Withdrawals, transfers to my father's management company, a dozen quiet mechanisms. The 15% that the law had locked away for me added up with the interest it should have earned to a sum with a great many more digits than 4,000. We settled. They had to refinance the house to do it. The house my mother had screamed was bought with my money, which felt like a circle closing. I won't tell you the number. I'll tell you it was enough to buy back the thing they'd actually stolen, which was never really the money. It was the 18 years I'd spent believing I was a debt. There were a few smaller aftershocks I didn't expect. My Aunt Pam called me a week after Christmas and apologized for 20 years of nodding along to the sacrifice story. She told me she'd always felt something was off, the way the money talk never quite added up, but that Sheila had a way of making you feel disloyal for asking, so she never did. We all just let her narrate, Pam said. I'm sorry, honey, the whole family let her narrate. That apology meant more than I expected, because it confirmed I hadn't imagined the machine. A room full of adults had felt it running and chosen not to look for 20 years, until a 12-year-old's voicemail made looking unavoidable. I don't speak to my parents now. I want to be honest that this isn't a triumphant silence. It's just silence. My mother sent one letter through her lawyer calling me vindictive and saying I'd destroyed this family for money. I didn't answer it. There's nothing to recover there. You can't get an accounting from someone who refuses to open the books. Cody is a different story. My brother transferred to a state school, partly because the money situation changed, and partly, he told me, because he didn't want to keep living inside a lie that expensive. He calls me every week now. Real calls. He asked me once what I'd been like as a kid, the real version, not Mom's version. I told him I'd been a careful, anxious little girl who thought being good was the only way to keep the adults calm. He was quiet, and then he said, "You don't have to be good to keep me calm, John. You can just be my sister." I had to pull over for that one. We talk sometimes about the machine. That's what we call it now. The machine our mother built. He's been doing his own work on the parts of it that got installed in him. The sense that he was the lucky, cherished one who could never quite earn the luck, that he was always disappointing some standard set by an older sister who never asked for anything. It took him a while to forgive me for being that standard, even though I never chose it. It took me a while to understand that he'd been used against me as surely as I'd been used against him. We were both roles in her production. The best thing that came out of that Christmas isn't the settlement. It's that two kids who were written as opposites finally got to compare scripts and realize neither of us wrote a word of it. I found Marty's number in my favorites the day the settlement closed, and I called him. I told him it was done, that his 18-year-old caution had held up in the end, that the voicemail he left a kid who probably wouldn't understand had been the thing that broke it open. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "I left those messages for years and never knew if a single one would matter. You tell the others if you ever meet them. Tell them somebody kept the receipts." He passed away this spring. I'm glad I called when I did. I'm glad he knew. People ask if I feel guilty. doing it at Christmas in front of everyone. I've thought about it honestly. I don't. For 18 years, my mother stood up at that same table and told everyone I was a debt the family generously carried. And I sat there and ate it every time and called it keeping the peace. I set the truth down at the table exactly once. That's not vengeance. That's an accounting finally coming due. The kind the law says I was always owed. I keep the voicemail still. I don't listen to it for pain anymore. I listen to it sometimes when I forget who I am, when the old guilt tries to tell me I was an expensive, ungrateful child. I press play, and an old man's gravelly voice from when I was 12 tells me the truth my parents spent my whole life hiding. That account is yours. They cannot touch it. If anyone ever tells you it was empty, you call me. I called him. It took 12 years, but I called him, and it turned out the most valuable thing I ever earned as a child wasn't in the account at all. It was a 60-second message from the one adult who refused to help them rob me, left on a phone they forgot existed, saved by a 12-year-old who had no idea she was keeping the receipt that would set her free.